Hello and welcome. My name is Alexa Milne with CFIB, and we're very happy to be back to present our COVID-19 weekly webinar with you. If you are new to the GoToWebinar platform, I will make a few technical notes before we begin. On the webinar panel, the blue or orange flower icon on your screen, you'll see the handouts pane. Here you can find today's presentation. You can open, save, and follow along. There's also a questions pane where you can enter your questions for our panelists today. We do try to answer as many questions either through the chat box direct to you or during our live Q&A session towards the end of our presentation. Following the webinar, please take a moment to complete a short survey to let us know your experience today. We do take your feedback and try to improve week over week. You'll receive a recording of today's session by email, and that should be in your inbox tomorrow afternoon. And with that, I will now introduce Corinne Pullman, our Senior VP, National Affairs and Partnerships. Thank you, Corinne.
Thanks, Alexa, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending you are in the country. Yes, you're getting me first thing today, and we actually have a few other different folks with us today to share with you this week's webinar. Many of you may know who I am. I've been on these webinars for quite a while, but if you're new, as Alexa said, I'm Senior Vice President, National Affairs and Partnerships, and part of my responsibilities is to basically lobby the federal government to make sure that they're listening to the needs of small business owners like you. So that's one of my few roles that I have at the organization. I'm also responsible for our partnerships, so all those savings programs as well that are available to our members. Joining me today, though, are Brendan Rolfe. So many of you already know Brendan. He is a business counselor, but also our lead business counselor, I would say, in Western Canada. Thanks, hi, Brendan. But joining us new today is Jean-Marc Usher. Jean-Marc is also a business counselor. He actually leads our business counselors in Montreal on our Quebec team, but he's also worked many years in Ontario as well prior to that. So we're the team today, and so we're happy to be here to sort of share with you some of the things that hopefully will be helpful to you as you go through employing people in the pandemic. So before we get started, we usually like to remind you that we are committed, of course, to making sure that the information on our website remains up to date. You can always go there. We often use the questions and answers from this particular sessions to also help us update our website. So we will try and do what we can to continue to keep that updated as new announcements come out. However, if we don't get to your answers today, and we will certainly try and endeavor to get to as many as we possibly can, please, we ask you to either go to our website, check it out there, or call us, call our helpline at 1-888-234-2232. All right, moving on to the next slide. All right, as I like to continue the tradition that Laura has always had in these webinars, we like to sort of start off with a few quotes that maybe help people think or inspire them a little bit. Here we have a few that I thought were quite, for me, quite interesting in terms of making you sort of keep going forward. Arthur Ashe, of course, the well-known tennis player, says, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to keep in mind. But Clement Stone talked about aiming for the moon, but if you miss, you may hit a star, which I kind of like the symbolism of that. Every exit is an entry to somewhere else. Tom Stoppard. And finally, probably my favorite one is, even if you fall on your face, you're still moving forward. So I think that the visual of that to me was quite funny, and I thought it would be one I wanted to share with you all today. All right, so moving to our next slide of what we are going to talk about today. Of course, we will go through a few things that are new. I'll walk you through some of those things, both within CFIB. We have a few things we wanted to share with you that are new at CFIB that you may not yet be aware of, but also, of course, our normal what's new in terms of government and with COVID. And I'm going to have my two colleagues, Brendan and Jean-Marc, walk you through a number of sort of tips and tricks around how to manage employees during COVID-19 based on many of the calls we already get from members. So they'll be sharing with you that. But of course, the questions after that can be on anything related to what we talked about today or any of the other programs or initiatives that you think you want to ask us about. We're more than happy to try our best to answer those questions. All right, so moving to the next slide. First, what's new at CFIB? Well, we're pretty excited to launch a new member portal. Some of you may have used our member portal in the past to sort of check on a few things in regard to your membership. We just launched this past week. And it's going to have a completely different look and feel. It's going to have a lot more features. And of course, it's going to be hopefully a lot easier for you to access than the previous one was. So we encourage you to go check it out. You can see there a bit of what it will look like if you do go in there, and the various types of things that you can do, such as edit your own profile, go into bills and payments, but also get access to information that is exclusive for members only. One of which is our resources library. If you go to the next slide, we're very excited to launch within our portal a resources library. And this is going to have all kinds of policy templates that you may find helpful for your business. There's everything from, I should probably get my colleagues to talk about this, but there's certainly different types of policies that may be helpful in your business that will help make it a lot easier for you to create those policies within your business. And they're all located in the resource library as part of our member portal. There is a vaccination template that's being worked on right now that may be helpful for those that may want to have a vaccination policy at their business, and it's still in progress. That will be coming soon. Next slide. So what else is new beyond what's going on at CFIB? Well, this past week, actually, I think it was the week before, the government did announce that they're extending the deadline for the Canada Emergency Business Account loans. It was going to end, access to apply for it was going to end on March 31st, 2021, but they have now pushed it off until June 30th, 2021. And this is for anybody who's applying for the CEBA loan for the first time or the CEBA expansion loan. And so that's good news, because I know that there were still many business owners still trying to get the CEBA loans in various categories, including the CEBA expansion. Now, if you have any questions, you can check the status of your CEBA loan if you've already applied for it but haven't heard anything by going online. You can also call the CEBA call center. We do have the phone number there. You can email us at ceba@cfib.ca. We'll certainly try to help you through if those other two avenues don't work for you. And of course, if you can also call our business helpline at any time if you're still having questions around the CEBA loan. But that will still be, I think there's a bit of collective breaths that people have taken that you still have some time now to apply if it's still something that's on your radar. The next slide. We also want to let you know that Bill C-24 was just passed in the House, and what that bill does is it actually extends the income support programs. These are the personal support growth programs, the ones that are offered through the special EI program right now, the Canada Response Benefit, the Canada, I think that's the caregiver benefit, as well as the, I think it's one is the caregiver, I can't exactly remember all these acronyms, but I apologize, but I think one is for caregivers and one is for sickness. And as you can see below, you can see how they've been extended. For example, the Canada Response Benefit is going from 13 weeks to 25 weeks. That's for all those people who are not eligible for employment insurance. They can then apply for the Canada Response Benefit instead. So some of the folks may be people who are self-employed, but they've now extended that from 13 weeks to 25 weeks. I think that's the same thing for the caregiver benefit, and then the sickness benefit also gone from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. They can actually take up to 4 weeks now, but they can only use those 4 weeks once. They can't take 4 weeks multiple times. And the EI is going from 45 to 50 weeks, the special EI programs that are out there for those who are eligible for EI. So just to let you know that those are there. We have heard from some members who are concerned that it can be difficult to hire folks who may be on some of these programs because they believe that they may be better off. We are communicating that to the government as well, and who are trying to balance health and safety along with trying to encourage people to go back to work as soon as they possibly can. Next slide. So just wanted to let you know that the federal budget has been announced. It's going to be on April 19th. We are working very diligently in Ottawa right now, trying to get as much information to the hands of ministers and members of parliament to try to influence that budget as much as possible and make sure that it includes many measures that are going to help small businesses currently through the worst part of this pandemic and also after the fact in terms of recovery. So that's something we'll be watching very closely, and between now and April 19th, we'll continue to pound the pavement and put as much pressure as we can on government to make some commitments that we believe are going to be important to help you. We've talked about some of those pre-budget recommendations in past webinars, but I'm happy to do so again as we get closer to the budget so you can kind of see what it is we're trying to encourage governments to do. On the provincial front, we did hear Saskatchewan and Ontario did extend their small business COVID support programs. Saskatchewan, unfortunately, is going into a bit more of a lockdown in some parts of Saskatchewan, hence they've also extended their small business support programs, and Ontario had their budget yesterday, and part of that, they actually doubled their Ontario support program and announced that they will soon be launching a hospitality and tourism grant, because many of those businesses, were not eligible for the small business support grant. However, there were not that many details yet to put out on that new program. So as soon as we hear more, we're going to certainly share that with our Ontario members. In addition to this, there are restrictions that are varied across Canada. Some people are actually going backwards, or they've actually stalled their reopening plans. For example, in Alberta and Manitoba, others have had to restrict a bit more, but there are jurisdictions starting to open up a bit more. For example, I know in Newfoundland and Labrador, they are starting to reopen once again. So it really does vary quite extensively across the country. And so that's where we're at today, unfortunately. We are still nowhere. While vaccines continue to roll out, we're still in a bit of a holding pattern in too many parts of Canada at this point in time. Okay, I think what we're going to do now, I believe the next slide, I'm going to be turning it back over to my colleagues. So Brendan and Jean-Marc, I think you're going to take it over from here, and I will be back closer to the end to help with the questions. Over to you, Brendan and Jean-Marc.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Corinne. And as Corinne introduced, I'm the Business Resources Manager for Western Canada, and my colleague Jean-Marc is the Business Resources Manager for Quebec. And that equates to a substantial part of our membership here at CFIB, but it should be noted as well that we work across the country. So it doesn't matter where our butts are in the seats. We assist members from Ontario, all parts of the West, Quebec, Atlantic. If you call in at some point, chances are we've heard about your issue and that we've helped to solve those issues at hand. So as you all may be aware, CFIB is founded on three main pillars. The first is our foundational element, which is our lobbying and advocacy, which we were founded on almost 50 years ago, actually. The second is our business resources department, and our third is our savings programs. Now, what you may not know is our business resources department is staffed by human resources professionals. So essentially, business resources to you is human resources. And it still surprises me how many people call in and say, you know what, I wasn't even aware that we had this resource available to us. Now, why is our business resources department essential to your business? Because we always look at human resources as buckets of risk. So risk assessment to your business. And how we can help you navigate that is by knowing all of the various pieces of legislation and regulations that are in place, such as workers' compensation, employment standards, and human rights, and to help you navigate the pressure points with your day-to-day management for your employees. So what my colleague and I are going to do in the following few slides is address some of the main pressure points that we hear about from our staff on the phone lines, try to give you some proactive information on how to manage your employees, and then hopefully troubleshoot with you some questions as we go along, because inevitably those questions will roll in as you consider how the information pertains to the current situations you're facing with your workers. So if we advance to the next slide, these are the topics that we're going to discuss. I'll be covering vaccinations, an ever debatable topic amongst our membership and the public at large, PPE and health and safety, and absenteeism. My colleague Jean-Marc will offer his expertise surrounding disciplinary action, terminations and layoffs. He'll address a good question surrounding government funding, not just COVID related, but also other types of government funding available to your business outside of COVID, that lens and scope, as well as compliance. And regulatory compliance is something that immediately at its verbiage puts people to sleep, but it is necessary for you as a business owner to know what policies and templates and procedures you're required to have in your business by law. So the first one I'd like to cover is vaccinations. And this really stemmed as a larger issue from the collaborative webinar that we conducted with Sherrard Cuz law firm 2 weeks ago. And as I mentioned, it's a topic that's hotly debated in the public arena. And so I thought it was very important to first establish what CFIB's position is on vaccines. And we've been asked this on the business resources line as well. And it's important to note that first and foremost, CFIB ourselves, we don't have a position on a lot of topics, not only those in the public arena, but we don't actually have a position in the political arena until we survey you, our membership. your position is essentially our position. If we have a strong majority in either facet, then we will lobby in those positions and we can speak to that publicly. But otherwise, CFIB, we don't take our own position on anything. I also want to assure you that because we don't have any medical professionals nor lawyers on staff, we can't actually publicly speak to the efficacy or the legitimacy surrounding, medical claims or legal claims. The best we can do in our role as your resource is to advocate for your business to operate how you need to operate, as well as create resources and offer support when you do have to navigate the pitfalls that are associated with things like vaccinations. So if you have, for instance, somebody who comes into your workplace and refuses to wear a mask but doesn't have a medical exemption, how do you manage that situation? And that's what our Business Resources Department is here to help you with. And that's actually why our friends at Sherrod Cuz said that having a vaccination policy, not that you're pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination, but just having one to address a situation as it arises when it's brought to your doorstep is advisable so that there's no surprises and so that your legal risk, and there it is the word again, is minimized as much as possible. So a question we get as well, and it's a very, very good question, is can you make vaccinations mandatory for your staff? So this is going to be debated in the public arena and the legal arena for a while. The information we currently have at hand is that you cannot require your staff or any incoming staff, applicants for new jobs, to be vaccinated. From what we currently know, it could be considered a violation of their Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Again, we don't have any lawyers on staff, but those lawyers we have consulted have, for the most part, consolidated this thought and are unified in this decision. Now, interestingly enough, I received a call from a member in Ontario, I believe it was the end of last week, who said that they actually heard a radio spot being broadcast in Toronto where a lawyer came on the radio and actually said that not only can you require vaccinations of your staff, but that you should. Otherwise, you might face legal liability should a customer or client claim that they actually contracted a communicable disease from your staff. So there is even debate amongst the legal arena, but our line, from what we understand, is that it is not worth the risk for you to make this an established protocol in your workplace. Now, can you incentivize vaccinations? Yes, you can. Now, we have to be very careful in terms of how we incentivize that amongst our employees, because we can't be seen to be punishing those who choose not to vaccinate. So you might consider, offering added vacation time in order to go get vaccinated, so a paid day off. You might consider other types of incentivized, financials or incentivize areas that might create a little bit more interest in being vaccinated. But again, you have to be very careful on how to structure those so that you're not penalizing those who choose not to. Now, why would you incentivize vaccination? Well, we'll address that in a few later slides, but things surrounding WCB claim premiums can be affected, missed days due to sickness, things like that can cost your business money, might potentially be mitigated by employees receiving vaccines. Again, this is not a statement by CFIB. We don't have any medical professionals on staff stating that this is fact. However, some of the research we have seen out there and suggestions by law firms have suggested that perhaps vaccinations can help lower the amounts of illness and that you can save money going that way, going forward. So to our next slide, we have some more Q&A surrounding vaccinations. Will priority vaccination be given to certain sectors, i.e. frontline workers? And we've seen yes. In various provinces, they have established who those are, what those frontline workers are. And it varies from province to province, but it does follow a pretty similar strain in that you'll see a lot of healthcare professionals are right at the top of that list, as well as those employees who are exposed to what they call vulnerable populations. So those who already have a sickness, the extremely young or the extremely old, basically those who, if they transmitted the disease, potentially it could cause more harm in the individual they transmit it to. We're also getting questions from those in industries who potentially are frontline workers, but maybe haven't been recognized yet. So for instance, let's say you run a cleaning business and you clean workplaces, you clean residences. Potentially those are exposed frontline staff. So how can you get your staff added to that list or your industry added to that list? And you can actually contact your public health authority or public health unit and basically lobby on your own behalf to create a case for your industry. When will they be available? It's important to note, too, that this varies from province to province. Some have already started rolling out vaccines to the general public, whereas we're hearing that some are still waiting until April to be able to roll them out to the various segments of the population that they deem to be higher risk. Will there be a cost to vaccinations? And I always kind of chuckle at this one. So no, there will be no out-of-pocket cost to you or to your workers for getting the vaccination. But let's be honest, there's no such thing as government money, so we're all paying for it in the end via taxes. Also, something else that's important to note is we recently saw, I believe it's the beginning of this week or the end of last week maybe, new legislation introduced in Saskatchewan where employers must offer 3 hours of paid work time to go get vaccinated to an employee. Again, you can't require this of your worker, but much like voting, they do have to have this option, and is now legislated so that if they do choose to do this during business hours, you do have to continue paying their wages during that time. So moving on to the next slide, let's address PPE and health and safety. Now, obviously the lens of COVID is going to require that we discuss in some facet it related to COVID, but the requirement for health and safety amongst your workers has always been there, quite frankly. So to touch on COVID considerations, masks, posters, daily check-ins, distancing, and cleaning are still mandatory, along with the policies that go with it, to explain to your workers how they must conduct themselves in order to limit communication of the pathogen. And this is likely to continue, actually, even as the population becomes vaccinated. What we hear, of course, from medical professionals is that if you have a vaccine, while it may limit the symptoms, if you do catch it, it does not stop you as being a spreader. And public health authorities across the country have given early indications that even as we become a vaccinated population, all of the other procedures will likely have to continue for the foreseeable future. I touched on the necessity to have a communicable disease policy earlier, and this is because a lot of the WCB boards across the country have actually considered communicable diseases such as COVID, such as SARS, to be an acceptable workplace injury claim. So what this means is that if a worker can prove that it happened at work, they received it at work, which can be difficult, they can actually file a claim with WCB and claim their benefits through WCB while they are off and recovering from this disease. Now, obviously, this is an arena that CFIB lobbied against when it first came out because it sets a very dangerous precedence. I mean, if you can start claiming a sickness caught at work, maybe or maybe not caught at work, where does that end? So we continue to lobby for real tight restrictions surrounding the types of claims that can be accepted. I am happy to report that thus far, though, the acceptance rate for these types of claims in the workplace has been fairly limited across the country, and that so far it seems to be that they're administering it well. Jean-Marc, do you have anything to add about that currently?
Yeah, just to piggyback on your point, the threshold is really high for a claim like this to be accepted. So don't worry too much about it. As far as you putting in the proper procedures and measures to make sure that doesn't happen in the workplace, that's what will be tested. Otherwise, yeah, the threshold is extremely hard for you to have a claim like this approved.
Yeah, very, very insightful and great point, Jean-Marc. And he made a great point there too, is if you have the policies and procedures in place in order to mitigate that risk, so what we call it is proving due diligence, that you've done everything within reason to limit the potential transmission of communicable diseases in your workplace, the likelihood of them actually accepting that claim is much, much lower. Whereas if you don't have these things in place, they're far more likely to accept that claim. So that's the importance of whichever side of the COVID virus you stand on, if it's legitimate or illegitimate, or whichever side of vaccines you stand on, it's still important to have these things in place to protect your business and to protect you for potential financial hits. So thanks for that, Jean-Marc. That's very insightful. The next thing I'd like to discuss is not necessarily in the frame of COVID. It's return to work. Now, we always have, all of us, have had workers who have become injured either at work or outside of work. Now, the interesting note is that no matter where they were injured, their position is protected while they are on leave of absence. This means you cannot terminate them except for a limited circumstance, which Business Resources can help talk you through. But the general rule is you cannot terminate them while they are off work, again, whether they were injured at work or outside of work. This can leave you in a pretty large liability area for wrongful dismissal. It's also important to note that most WCB boards across the countries have what they call a stay-at-work prerogative. This means that the stats that they've collected have actually shown that if workers are able to stay at work, even for limited hours doing limited duties, so what they call light duties, they're far faster to return to work and far more likely to come back in a functional manner. Now, the realities of running a small or medium-sized business in Canada is that our workers fulfill a very essential role. Chances are you can't just slide them into another job that could be considered light duties and still have them as a productive worker who's contributing to the betterment of your business. So if this is the case and you absolutely cannot offer light duties, you don't have to. And I really want to stress this because WCB, like I said, their prerogative, their mandate is to have workers stay at work. So some of them have gotten pretty aggressive with our members and said, look, you need to take them back under light duties. And they basically put their foot down and stood their ground. And I'm telling you that you don't have to. Don't let them push you around. If you absolutely cannot find work, meaningful work for this worker to keep them at work or to return them to work early, you can stand your ground as well and just say, look, it's just not a reality. If you feel like you're getting bullied, call our business resources department. We do have the resources to navigate those WCB issues, and sometimes we can even reach out on your behalf in order to add that extra layer of support if you're feeling a little bit bullied. I would also like to mention what's called the need to make an accommodation. So they call it under human rights a duty to accommodate. And again, this is if a disease or an injury was suffered at work or outside of work, is you do need to make an effort to accommodate an employee. So again, if there's light duties available, that can be considered an accommodation. If they come back to work or want to come back to work but can't necessarily be working in the warehouse and lifting 60 pounds at a time, if you have the ability to accommodate them in another role, or if you can somehow make their role somewhat less strenuous and it's not too much of a hardship placed upon your business, then you are expected to do so under the Human Rights Act. If you're unsure of what this looks like, definitely call our business resources. We can help you navigate these potential landmines. What I've also mentioned there is there's something called a functional abilities form, the FAF, which is also known as a fit to work assessment. Now, if you have an employee who comes back claiming that they need accommodations, what you can do is send this with your employee. You fill it out and basically say exactly what their duties are. So employee needs to lift 50 pounds, employee must rotate under load so that their physician knows what their specific duties are. And you can have their physician fill this out. And the physician will either say, yes, they can do these duties, or no, they cannot perform these duties. Now, this is important because if they say, yes, this person is physically fit to perform these duties, then the expectation is that the worker comes back to work and can perform all things that were required of them beforehand. If they say no, then legally we can wait until they're 100% ready to return to work, or if accommodations can be made, we can then look at accommodating in that manner. The last thing I want to mention is if you need to send workers abroad as part of your operational plan, so if you send workers out of province or out of country, you should note that you must register that worker with the WCB board in the province that they're going to be performing work. So their current WCB insurance in your province does not cover them abroad. If they're going to perform work in another province, you should know, though, that if they have to perform work out of country, so for instance, let's say you send a worker to the United States, you don't actually have to register with the WCB board down in the States. That would be an absolute nightmare. Instead, their current workplace policy does cover them when working out of country. So touching on the last topic that I will cover before my colleague offers insight, there it pops up again. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Is absenteeism. Jean-Marc, do you have anything to add to that fact or to that last slide? Oh, I think you're on mute.
To your previous point with regard to the WCB, one very important fact is even if your WCB claims to have coverage that extends sometimes 3 months or 6 months, you can be in violation in that province where your employee is going to operate because they don't always correlate those policies. Unfortunately, CFIB is lobbying hard for it to be uniform to reduce the interprovincial red tape, but unfortunately they don't always correlate. So make sure you verify with the local provincial authorities, even if your WCB coverage extends beyond 3 months or 6 months.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very good point. Thanks, Jean-Marc. The last thing I'd like to cover seems to be the bane of many business owners' existence, and this is employee absenteeism. Now, this can include employees showing up late, chronically to work, or this can include unexcused absences where there's no doctor's note. Maybe an employee tends to, in the summers, be sick on Fridays. So this is something that really is a tricky area to navigate, but if done right, it can give you a lot more abilities in terms of how you want to manage your workforce. So essentially, absenteeism has always been a workplace problem. It was before COVID and has turned into an absolute nightmare during COVID, mostly because a lot of these programs are based on the honor system. You didn't necessarily have to provide any types of documentation if you're an employee stating or corroborating the fact that you were sick, and you were allowed to collect basically unfettered by government regulations that business owners were constricted under. Now, the good news is that those programs and the rights and abilities of business owners has progressed somewhat to the point where you can start holding your employees a little bit more accountable. For instance, let's say I have a worker who says that they're feeling symptomatic and that they need to take the next 2 days off and that they're going to go get tested. Well, before I couldn't require any type of proof that they went to go get a test. I couldn't ask for the results. I couldn't ask if they were tested. And basically I just sort of was being held by my toes, strung up by my toes rather, until they wanted to come back to work, essentially. Now we can actually require them to get tested if they report symptoms, and we can require proof of the test. And of course, if they were negative, they need to come back to work. If they are positive, then they need to take the next steps, which could include self-isolation or quarantine. But the good news is now you do have a little bit more rights as an employer on how to manage your staff who make this type of claim. Again, call business resources before you take any steps. We want to keep you on the right side of the law and really limit your legal exposure in terms of things like human rights, WCB, and employment standards. But the question then is, what can you do? And thankfully, this is the same as pre-COVID times. The first is to have a good policy in place. Now, I can hear, I should say, a lot of our members eye roll when I mention the word policy, and that's fair. Nobody likes documentation. However, a good policy really is critical to not only limiting your exposure, but to strategically managing your workforce, because what it does is it provides clear guidelines on what a worker and an employer can expect when certain situations arise. And if you take the mystery out of those situations, inevitably the legal exposure and risk goes down with that. So if we have a comprehensive policy that informs employees and the business owner of what the next steps are and what actions will be taken in certain situations, it'll make it a lot easier to avoid conflict potentially. So create a policy. That's the first thing. If you don't have a policy, CFIB does have a policy for you. We call it the communicable disease policy. If you're going to request it to your BR, make sure you call it that, communicable disease policy. Our business resources counselors will have it in your hands very, very shortly when you do. The next thing is the application of that policy, and the key word to that is consistency. If I have a written policy in place to avoid a potential discrimination claim, I need to apply the clauses, and I need to apply the practicality of that policy, consistency to every single employee when the same situation arises. We need to be seen to be doing things the same for every single employee. And if we start making exceptions in certain areas, that's when our risk of a discrimination claim arises. And the last thing too is a good policy will offer a contingency. So what I mean by a contingency is, let's say there's something that occurs that's unexpected surrounding the issue. A good policy will look for the potential pitfalls and will address that. If you don't have that, of course, I like to say a CFIB is your contingency. So if you have a situation that makes you pause, it's perhaps not addressed in policy, please give us a call. Again, we'll absolutely try to do our best to keep you on the right side of employment standards, human rights, and workers' compensation issues. So in brief, how to manage an employee or a worker with consistent attendance problems. And this can be very frustrating. It can be very difficult to separate yourself emotionally from the situation. And I'll admit it. I'll be the first to admit it over my 7 years here at CFIB. Some employees are just selfish jerks. I mean, I'll say it. I've worked with them, not here, of course, in a previous lifetime. And I've seen firsthand and talked to firsthand business owners who are quite frankly having their business not destroyed, but certainly made extremely disruptive by employees who just don't show up regularly or on time. I would advise you to ask the why. Before we go in as sort of the old disciplinary, which my colleague will get to in a second, the old disciplinary action of a slap on the wrist and saying, don't do this again or else, I'd advise you to go into why. What's happening in your life that's requiring you to, come in 15 minutes late every day, or why are we missing 1 day per week of work? Oftentimes when we ask the why, a worker will offer a viable reason, or they won't offer a viable reason. But either way, it puts the onus on them and the ball in their court to take some responsibility for their actions. To find out the why. It's also very possible with a worker is that, they're showing up 15 minutes late to work every day because they have to drop their kid off at school. And they split the difference. So they say, you know what, I'll drop my kid off 15 minutes early. I'll show up 15 minutes late. Yeah, I'm late, but hey, it's not a big deal. It's 15 minutes. It can be a big deal. But if you can make a simple adjustment in terms of the hours worked for them each day and slide it 15 minutes later, now everybody's a lot happier. There's less pressure on the worker, and you know what you're getting from them in terms of an honest day's work. The next thing I'd ask you to do is troubleshoot with the employee. You don't have to have all the answers as the employer. There's a perception out there that as an employer, you should be the know-all, be-all, end-all in terms of how to manage workplace situations. But what we can do and what we've seen is in terms of new best practice is putting the ball in the worker's court. Ask them, okay, I see that you miss 1 day per week every single week on a Friday. How do you think we should solve this? What do you think we can do to support you to come to work each Friday to make sure that we get a full day's work? Sometimes they can have great ideas. Sometimes they don't have any ideas. But once we show that we've asked the worker for solutions, we've shown our willingness to accommodate them, as well as our willingness to try to support this worker in becoming a better worker. And ultimately, if you look at case law across the country, that's what the courts want to see now. They want to see that an employer tried to support a worker in terms of becoming a better worker, rather than just sort of saying, hey, you're not cutting it, you need to pick it up or else we're going to fire you. Under those types of scenarios, the potential for a wrongful dismissal claim is far greater. Whereas if you're seen to be supportive, if you're seen to be as trying to find a solution to make them the employee you thought you were hiring, if ultimately you need to terminate down the road, we've seen a lot more willingness for courts when challenged to accept that termination as valid. And then the last point I want to put on there too with attendance management is follow-up. Let's not leave it to chance and wait for the next instance where maybe they become a good employee again for 6 weeks, but then they relapse into their attendance issues following that. Let's have a regular meeting with that employee. If they want to touch base 5 minutes every morning, once per week, continuing that touch point and that communication between you and the worker, research has shown, tends to make them a far more reliable employee and, quite honestly, a more engaged worker who's going to be more productive for you. So set standardized follow-up dates and do your best to maintain those, at all costs. The employee also sees that you're making them a priority this way, and again, they're going to become a lot more engaged, a lot more in tune with your brand, and a lot happier and more productive of a worker. And the last part at the bottom there is document, document, document. And I've added exclamations and bold to that type because ultimately we need to show, worst case scenario, this ends up in courts. We need to show that we've tried to support this employee. We've done everything we can do within reason to make them the worker that we hope they are. Ultimately, some employees are beyond saving. And if the time comes when you need to terminate them, you need to be able to prove that it was warranted and that you did everything you could as an employer to help grow them to the employee you wanted them to be. It just wasn't a reality for that to work out. So that concludes the slides that I'd like to discuss right now, and I'd like to invite Jean-Marc to come back and offer his expertise on the following, which is going to include disciplinary action, it's going to include terminations, government funding, and all the juicy ones that everybody's hopefully waiting to hear. And I'm going to stay on as well just to add some color commentary where possible. Jean-Marc, take it away, sir. We got you on mute.
Thank you, Brendan. So we're gonna go to the next slide. When it comes to disciplinary action, the first thing that you want to keep in mind, old school disciplinary does not work. Meaning, essentially, don't go with the punitive approach. Have an approach when it comes to support, development, coaching, mentorship in some situation, regardless of the situation, because this will help you if the relationship were to end. It will keep you away from any type of legal exposure. It might mitigate the risk of legal exposure to a lawsuit. So make sure you keep the relationship intact when it comes to this. Now the process is always the same. Conversation is gold. That's where you will try to iron out miscommunication, having a meeting with the worker, identify the actual issue, and try to collaborate on a solution. It might be a win-win situation. You might have a situation with absenteeism or an attendance issue that's solely based on the employee's shift schedule, right? It's maybe you have a high producer who's just not built to come in at 8:30. Maybe he could start later in the day, and he will produce as much for you than he would if he were to start an early shift. So the collaboration between the employer and the employee in finding solutions to correct the issue will give you the winning combination. Now, it's not always it's not always easy to collaborate, especially when it comes to attitude issues or attitude problems. But even in those cases, as Brendan mentioned it earlier at the end of his slide, it's important for you to go through those processes in order to document what you've done prior to going into a termination scenario. You wanted to say something, Brendan?
Yeah, just to emphasize what you said is realize the fact that you've already invested in this employee. You went out to source them. You put money into interviewing them and hiring them and training them. And you did see something in them at the beginning. You saw that, hey, this person has the potential to be a great employee. So just like Jean-Marc said, communication is king. If you can find out the why, what's going on that's making you unhappy, unproductive, etc., maybe you can find, dust off that gem. And maybe you got a star worker once again.
Right. Yeah. And remember, there are some threshold. Obviously, if you have somebody that's within the probational period under 3 months and it just doesn't work out, that don't have to invest that much time in it in a process like this. Now, 3 strikes is still the best practice. And I'm going to say this even for the entire Ontario employers who don't necessarily need a reason to terminate an employee. But the reason why it's the best practice is because, just to go back to the documentation point, you have to be able to show why is it that you made that decision if ever this case gets outside of the realm of the Ministry of Labor and it goes to the tribunal. So make sure that the limit test is always, have I done everything in my power to make sure that this employee performs to their ability, to the best of their abilities, and have I given this employee enough time to change their behavior? Now, a verbal warning can be given, obviously, and then you would want to give the employee enough time after the verbal warning to change their behavior. A good threshold is, think about the seniority of the employee and look at how much notice this employee would receive. So, and then try to amount that time. So if it's a one year or 2 years, giving them 2 weeks to find out if they're changing their behavior. Now, if that still doesn't work, then you go in with a written warning. But those are not, you're not married to verbal or written warning. You can even decide to go to a written warning directly, depending on the severity of the issue. So, but the reason why you want to have that process again is because you want to be able to document as much information. And just to go back on the meeting, even if you have a meeting and you also give a verbal warning to this employee, you can even write, on March 25th, we had a discussion over attendance issue. And and we provided him with a verbal warning, and that's documented in his file. You don't need to give that to the employee, right? So it provides you with ways for you to document the whole situation and process. And finally, if you want to go into a termination after that, then you'll have enough information to make that decision, and you would have given the employee enough chances and benefit of the doubt before you would have taken the decision to terminate. If we were to move to the next slide. Very good. So termination and layoffs, 2 differences here. One is permanent, the other one is temporary. Now, when it comes to a termination, you have to go through the previous step that we described, And then you would have to provide either notice or termination pay, depending on the province that you are in. Now, you always have to take into consideration common law. As an employee, even if you fulfill the minimum standard under the labor standard, which are called minimum standard, an employee can go and seek further through the tribunal system, so through common law. So sometimes maybe the thinking should be, maybe I should offer more than what the minimum is, and maybe work with a lawyer to to have something that would protect me from any type of legal proceedings. And being proactive like this could save you time and money. So be very careful. As far as you also want to be very careful when it comes to just cause. A lot of employers they go directly to that. And just cause is in the situation where the employee has done irreparable harm to your company, reputation, or other employees or clients, and it's borderline criminal. Like the threshold is very high. I mean, we've seen a lot of weird situation in business resources, even in situation of theft where just cause was not accepted. So tread lightly with just cause. Sometimes you might spend more time trying to argue your position than if you had just given the employee notice or termination pay, right? So it's really your time versus principle, essentially. So be very careful with that. And one point here that I've seen in my years as a business counselor is emotion. If you're not able to remove yourself from a situation like this, where you're emotionally involved because because of what the employee has done, or two things you can do: either work with your general manager if you have one to make that decision, or an HR professional to do that, or simply call us. Call one of your business resource counselor, vent on the phone, empty your bag, and then go make that decision with a clear head, because you don't want to make an emotional decision when it comes to termination. Now, finally, when it comes to temporary layoffs, obviously in some provinces you have to be very careful that you might have to give a notice, especially in Quebec, for example. If the layoff is longer than 6 months, you have to give a 2 weeks notice. But be mindful of that point, because you can't just proceed with the layoff. And if you are going to do a layoff, think about as well the return. When is going to be the return date? What's going to be, do you have recall documents for the employees? Are your employees going to be qualifying for EI during that period? That's a big point, because that's going to help you retain those talent. If an employee goes on layoff and they don't qualify for EI, chances are they're going to try to find work somewhere else, right? So make sure you cross all the T's, and you figure out all these details before you make the decision for layoff. And finally, have a good reason to lay off an employee. Don't lay off an employee while business is booming and saying that it's shortage of work because you just don't like his attitude, because then that could lead to constructive dismissal. So be very careful on that point, and as well as make the right decision based on the time frame. Brendan, you wanted to add anything to this?
Yeah, great points, really good points. And that's it too. If you're going to be replacing this employee, you can't use the temporary layoff as not an excuse, but as a reasoning behind the termination. And also going forward, looking at your employment contracts, you'll want to add temporary layoff clause in the contract itself. So you'll note there as one of the bullets that unless a temporary layoff is permitted under COVID provincial emergency regulations, or unless it's in the contract, you actually can't do it. Sometimes when it's an industry standard, so if it's seasonal business, like construction potentially, you are allowed to. But what we're seeing going forward is that best practice is for all of your employment contracts, just add a little clause in there regarding your ability to temporarily lay off an employee if it's required by the needs of the business.
Very good. Thank you, Brendan. If we can go now to the next slide. Very good. So some of you are already familiar with these programs, and some of you may not be, but there are still government funding out there to help you during this pandemic and this crisis. So you have funding to help you with your payroll when it comes to the emergency wage subsidy, as well as your source deduction when it comes to the temporary wage subsidy program. And if you are trying to combine EI, as well as EI, as well as your payroll and what you're able to pay your employees because work has slowed down. The work share program is also another program that you might want to consider. Again, one of the caveats here is that your employees have to be eligible for EI, so make sure that is covered before you go into that program. And then when it comes to the student wage subsidy, you have programs right now that could help you hire interns or young students during the summer for different projects if you need that extra labor force. Now for your fixed costs, you have the CEBA, the loan, the 40,000 loan has been popular as well. You can also borrow up to 60,000 now and get 25% of that amount as a subsidy if you repay within a certain time frame. And then you also have the rent subsidy program to help you with your rent and your spending. Big caveat here: do not confuse this program with SECRA. Those are two different programs, two different eligibility requirements. So you might not, be qualified for SECRA, but you probably would qualify for CERS. If none of these programs, and you know about these programs, and none of these programs fit you, or you're not eligible to these programs, then it would be time to look into the, regional relief, the RRFs, the regional relief recovery funds, as these programs have been built for people that been sort of fell through the cracks. And the last point is the ASCAP program. Obviously, this most recent one. This is for sectors that have been heavily hit by COVID. It's more so a loan that's 100% guaranteed by the government, and you could be covered to 10 years for the repayments, and you can borrow between 25,000 and up to $6 million in total. So those are the programs to help you with your fixed cost. Now, you do have as well, when it comes to income replacement, CERB, as far as independent workers or contractors out there, you do have access to CERB as well if your earnings have reduced by at least 50%. So make sure as well that you look into that. If you're not able to pay a full salary and take advantage of the CEWS for yourself as an independent business owner, you can look into CERB. And obviously, provincial-wise, you have a variety of different programs. You can look into our PDFs and check the hyperlinks to go into those different provincial programs. And one thing that is sometimes overlooked is at your local level, check with your business centers, your municipalities. They often have funds that come from the federal government or the provincial government for a specific program. So make sure you also check with your municipality as well, not just at the provincial level, but at the local level as well. We can move on to the next slide. Very good. Now, there is a great tool to find funding. We as business counselors always get these questions as to, is there a subsidy for this project? Is there a subsidy for that? Can I get a subsidy to buy new equipment? Well, Innovation Canada has a great tool to help you find the subsidy that actually exists out there. So if you were to use the hyperlink that it's in the PDF, you could have access to those tools. You can find for income support. You can also find subsidies for your business, especially. If we move to the next slide, you'll see an illustration of the actual questionnaire that you have to use. And the reason why we did this, I think, there's also to show you what it looks like. And also to let you know, there are a lot of scammers out there that will try to sell you subsidy lists, list of subsidies, lists of programs, or will promise you to get you subsidies. Be very careful. Don't go into this. The government provides those lists for free. And if it's not on those websites, generally it does not exist. If it's not on those websites, if it's not at the local level, it does not exist. Keep in mind the principle of a subsidy in pre-COVID was to either stimulate a sector that is non-existent in Canada in order to make it competitive at a global stage, or help support underrepresented groups. So there are, those are certain principles. So it might be very difficult to find a subsidy to buy additional machinery, but it might not be if you are a startup, for example, or you are a young entrepreneur. You might have access to some of those subsidies. So keep an eye on this, and go also, like I said earlier, go at the local level and find out what is offered to you. If we can move on to the next slide. Very good. Now, COVID or not COVID, these things have not changed. Regular compliance is still a thing. You're about to reopen your business for some of you. You're starting the year in lockdown, and now things are sort of looking, sort of better. Keep in mind that when it comes to your municipal compliance, as far as business license and permits, a lot of these agencies have not changed the dates. They have not changed the deadlines for you to file or for you to report or make payments. When it comes to federal compliance, it's still the same privacy regulations. If you don't have access to any of this information, please contact our business counselors. We'll be able to assist you. As far as provincial regulations on the health and safety side for violence and harassment, occupational health and safety, these are still prevalent. So make sure that you have your policy are up to date, the trainings are up to date, because you don't want to be penalized because of that. Obviously, COVID compliance is a big thing right now. So if you need some advice, some assistance, make sure you give us a call as well. 1-888-234-2232. The business counsel will be able to assist you with that. So I think that concludes my part. If we can.
Yes, so thank you both. Wow, we're almost out of time. So we hopefully can take a few minutes at least to answer a few questions. I know a lot of them have been coming in as the two of you were sharing lots of really good information in regards to employing folks during COVID. I don't know if either one of you can answer some of these questions, and I'll just say to the folks that are listening, we do tend to go over just a little bit, like 5 minutes or so, just so we can get some of those questions in. I know I've been certainly working on trying to answer as many questions as I can on the side, and it looks like Brendan's doing the same. But I wanted to ask both of you, Corinne, another Corinne, so nice name, Corinne. If we have an employee on leave and we have only received notice through a fax from a doctor, are we allowed to contact the employee to see when they may be back? Is there something you could provide as feedback to Corinne on that front?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing you want to do is, first of all, keep the line of communication open. Certainly, you certainly can communicate with the employee to find out what their status is. When it comes to medical leaves, you always want to have an approximate date. So even if the employee is not able to provide you with a sure date, get an approximate date in your books. That way you can follow up when that time comes. And also keep in mind, keep an eye on when this doctor's note will expire. So that's also another point that you could follow.
Great, thanks, Jean-Marc. I also have another from Tina. She's asking, if your employee states they have been vaccinated, can you request proof from them? Brendan, that's maybe in your
I'll field that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll field that one. I guess my question to you would be, why would you ask for this? So as we discussed before in the earlier parts of the webinar, we can't actually require an employee to get vaccinated. My thoughts are, my inclination, and Jean-Marc, correct me if you feel otherwise, but this request would put you into a liable position in terms of human rights. Let's say, for instance, that this worker, you requested it, the worker said, I'm not giving it to you, and then for some reason the relationship went sour. So now you've got a disgruntled worker looking for a reason to punish you. This feels like an area where they can point back and get a lawyer and point back to the fact that, hey, everything changed after I refused to provide this vaccination letter, vaccination confirmation to them. I believe I'm being treated differently because I chose not to. And that's grounds as protected by human rights, and it could put you in a liable position. So just in general, I would always ask, when considering whether or not to request a doctor's note from an employee of any kind, ask yourself the why. How does this pertain to how I'm going to manage my business and my employee going forward? If there's no clear benefit or necessity to you or the business, I would say err on the side of not. So I guess to boil it down to a one-word answer, I'd say no. Don't ask for that vaccination note. And
so Tina added a bit of an addendum. She said, if they ask for me, this is if they ask for time off to get vaccinated, but I don't think that really changes been a thing for you, right? Probably not.
Yeah. I mean, just like voting, it's on the honor system. So if they ask for that time, you are required to give it to them by law, and we can't ask for proof.
Yeah, very good. I'll grab one more here from Isabel, and then I might touch on a few non-HR related ones that have been coming in as well. But Isabel is asking, if an employee had COVID before they came back, can we ask for proof that they are now clear? I guess it's the same deal, right? Would it be any different in that circumstance?
Well, I mean, it's the same deal, but you can go through you can use different strategies. I think Brendan touched on the fit assessment, right? If someone had COVID, prior to they come back, if they followed the Ministry of Health guidelines as far as a quarantine procedure, and then obviously the testing, at the end of the day, if you were to ask for a fit assessment, are you 100% able to come back to work? And I would need a doctor to sign off on it. That could be sort of a way for you to protect yourself if the employee does not volunteer the information. Because privacy regulations when it comes to medical information have not changed, even with COVID. So you can't really ask that directly unless it's volunteered.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Marc. I'm just going to touch quickly on a few other questions that came up. There's been a few around the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy and whether there's been any progress on the folks who are dealing at non-arm's length. So if you both own the building and rent from that building, for example, that continues to be an issue. We're continuing to push on. It's something that has not yet been resolved. So we're hopeful that something will become resolved, maybe around budget time. We're not sure, but we continue to apply a lot of pressure. Unfortunately, though, the rule is still in place. Secondly, was around there's some questions around the wage subsidy. What's going to happen after June 5th? We don't know for the rent subsidy or the wage subsidy right now. Hopefully, again, we're putting a lot of pressure on government to make sure that they maintain those emergency programs as long as businesses are not able to fully reopen. So we need to make sure that there's something there in place. Again, hopefully the federal budget on April 19th will maybe give us some indications. It's definitely a big part of our pressure that we're laying on the government right now to make sure that they're not just going to get rid of it June 5th, should the circumstances be that businesses are still required to be at restricted capacity at that point in time. So those are a couple of the issues. I know that there were some other questions around the wage subsidy as well. So probably in a future webinar, we'll certainly go back to talking a bit more about some of the financial assistance that is out there, because we know on our phone lines too, it remains a very hot topic in terms of where folks can get some financial assistance. So rest assured that we'll continue to come back to those issues as we move forward. I know we're coming up, but maybe Brendan or Jean-Marc, do you have any questions that you want to throw out before we wrap things up? I'll start with you, Brendan.
Two, actually. One is a point of clarification for Michaela. She noticed that on our compliance slide, it did say under the daily check-ins, it said 30 days beside it. Now, the regulatory compliance part of that 30 days is that you have to keep those records of check-ins for 30 days after the check-in that just happened. But the requirement to continue with daily check-ins is ongoing. We'll definitely let you know, CFIB, either through e-news or on our website or both, when that requirement ceases in your province. But for now, that is still a requirement, but you do have to retain those records for at least 30 days afterwards. And then a really good question from Bridget. She basically, I'm going to boil it down. She has a lot of great points in there, but she basically says that as a small business, we have the mask policy as required by law. And for those who can't wear masks due to a medical exemption, if they don't have a medical exemption, they offer a face shield to be worn, things of that nature. And of course, we're having some people come into the workplace, some customers who say that it's against their human rights to force them to have to wear a mask, even if they don't have a medical exemption. So I think she's asking, is it against their human rights, and sort of how to navigate that situation. It's a really difficult situation. So as far as protected grounds human rights goes, those claims are in the courts still, and we'll see whether or not they are accepted. From our current knowledge base of human rights, having to wear a mask is not against anyone's human rights. And if you apply this policy, again, consistently and fairly amongst everyone, it can't be seen as a discrimination claim. Now, it's also important to note that you're under provincial health law that you have to require this in your workplace or you will face a fine. The same goes for individuals. If they're not wearing masks in public and they don't have a medical exemption, they're also required to do so, or else they can face fines personally. So what you should do if you have someone who refuses is do not engage them physically, and quite frankly, don't engage them in an argument or a debate surrounding each other's rights. Call the police. If they refuse, call the police, because the police are the ones who are tasked right now with enforcing those regulations surrounding masks, and they can issue fines as well. So they are the ones that you want to reach out to, your local police detachment, that's your RCMP or a city police force. Give them a shout. Again, don't engage the worker. Oftentimes, that's not fair. Sometimes that is what they're looking for, especially in cases where you have other ways to serve them, such as curbside pickup or online orders where you can deliver, as you mentioned, Bridget. So again, outline all the things that are available to them, otherwise that you can serve them. If they absolutely refuse all those things and refuse to wear a mask without a medical exemption, yes, you can, and in fact, have to refuse service to them. Otherwise, you can face a fine. So again, I would just outline, say, look, we have no other choice. Otherwise, we can face fines from the government. Hopefully that helps add some clarity.
Thanks, Brendan. Jean-Marc, any last question that you want to throw into the mix?
Well, there's been a question with regards to frontline workers and also some refusing to get vaccinated, and putting others at risk. I think it goes in line with what Brendan has said earlier. Probably the best thing to do is to work with a lawyer to maybe use our policy template as a starter to come up with your own policy. If you really need to impose a vaccination policy for your business because of how close your employees work from each other, maybe that's something you should validate with a lawyer in order to have a policy in place. But it's very sensitive right now, and there's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. Thanks, Jean-Marc, for bringing us that again. I think this is a very tricky area. Really, the best solution, we can't really provide clear answers. You really should be talking to your lawyer if it's something that, or a lawyer, if it's something that you think is important for your business. And of course, we will do what we can. We are working with lawyers on a vaccinational policy template. When it's available, we will let you know. But in the meantime, that's probably your best solution at this point in time if it's important to your business. Great. So we'll do some last rounds of goodbyes. So maybe start with you, Jean-Marc. Anything you want to say as we sort of close out this particular webinar?
Well, thank you. I'm usually part of the French side on the French webinar, so thank you for inviting me to this one. And it was always a pleasure to speak to CFIB members and also be part of working with you guys. So thank you for that opportunity, and I hope that we were able to answer most of your questions. If we didn't, you can always contact our team, 1-888-234-2232. Business counselor in French or in English will be able to assist you.
Yes, and thank you for joining us, Jean-Marc. It's been great having you here. It's nice working with you every once in a while. Brendan, any final words?
Yeah, absolutely. And I started off my part of the presentation with this as well. As again, CFIB, we have no position regarding vaccinations, legitimacy of COVID. What we're here to do is fight for your ability to run your business the way you need to run your business. We take our direction from you, and our prerogative in business resources is to have those resources and support available to you so that you can navigate the rules that have been thrust upon us all, and so that we can stay in compliance. So ultimately that we all converge out of the pandemic fine-free, because obviously finances right now are very, very tricky, and the last thing you need is to be slapped with a few $1,000 fine. So whenever you're in doubt, as Jean-Marc said, give us a shout at BR. We are your HR professionals. Don't hesitate to call us ever. Unlimited amount of times you can call and unlimited amount of times you can talk to us. We're never going to hurry you off the phone. So give us a shout whenever you're free. Stay strong, and yeah, we're here for you. We're all in this together. I don't want to say that. I hate that line. We're here for you. We're in business for your business.
Yeah.
Brendan. All right. Well, thank you everybody again for joining us this week. As always, we take your questions. If we don't get to them, we will certainly incorporate them into our FAQs, and of course, helps me in my lobbying efforts as well. And I've gotten some great feedback today on some of that again. So thank you for that. Also, of course, if you have any suggestions or ideas for future webinars, we're very open to that right now. There's not as much coming up new from the government these days. We want to continue to do these and make sure we're providing you with information that is helpful. Certainly, so please provide us with any ideas that you may have. We are more than happy to try and bring in guests or do sort of theme type webinars that may be of interest to you as well. So thank you again for joining us this week, and hopefully we'll see some of you or hear from some of you in the next time that we get together. Could be next week. We may be going on a bi-weekly schedule, so we'd like your feedback on that as well, but we will certainly be in touch soon. Thanks again, and with that, we will shut the webinar down.
Thank you.